students? Welcome back to LifePoint Students Online. We are actually in week 4 of the King of Hearts series. Hard to believe, right? But this is going to be kind of a weirder day for us. If you're watching this right now, great, fantastic. We will not be having our in-person youth meeting at the church tonight. In fact, we're going to be doing our in-person gathering at someone's house. We're doing that a night at someone's house in place of meeting for lesson tonight. So I highly encourage you to watch this and interact with the small group lesson that follows. And if you can, we would love you to join us tonight. If you're part of our youth group, you would have already received the location for where we're meeting tonight. And since this is YouTube, I'm not going to say it. But if you are interested in going, you haven't been to our youth in a while, please feel free to email me. I'll give you the location and time. And just email me at jthomas@lifepointpa.org, and then I'll get you that information. So with that, just again, lesson here this week, meet in person tonight, and then we're back to regular in-person meetings next week. So with that, let's talk about week 4 of the King of Hearts series. Now, if you haven't joined us in a while or don't recall what we're really talking about, is this series is based on looking at the very infamous, notorious life of King Saul and looking at his misadventures or his disobedience and how we, as Christ followers today, can learn from that. So today's lesson is we're talking about a royal family. And I almost gave it away. Man, I always want to jump ahead so fast. But as you might guess, is that, and we have talked about this in previous lessons, that because of some disobedience on Saul's part, we know that he loses what will eventually be, or would have been, his dynasty. So we're going to kind of dive into that today. But we're getting our lesson from 1 Samuel 16, and chapter 16 and 18. So the big idea today that we really want to drive towards is that when we give God our heart, we believe we are who He says we are. And that's a pretty important, not lofty goal, but that's a really important goal, because once I think we have a sense of who God says we are, then we can have security in that too. And so that's kind of what we're driving to today. But to recap a little bit more in depth, King Saul chose to believe that he could follow God and continue to do things in his own way, in his own strength. And as you might recall, it backfires in a spectacular fashion. And because of his rebellion against doing things God's way, King Saul was stripped of his dynasty, and actually, more than that, his entire kingdom. So, what we're going to see here is that, and if you recall, we know that because of some of these things, Samuel keeps hammering King Saul about some of these very poor decisions. And as I already said, God already stated He's going to remove his hand of blessing upon Saul. I don't think Saul gets that fully yet. Again, it might be just in his nature or whatever, but it doesn't really sink in yet. But as a result of this, God has now sent Samuel out to find a new king. So that kind of puts us right smack dab into the start of our new lesson, which is, here's Saul going out to just find this king. A king that would choose to do life God's way more than anything. Okay, I can't stress that enough. We can't point that out enough. God is done giving them the poster boy of what a king should look like. And God was looking for a person who would give him his heart just to him. Okay, so that is essentially God's only prerequisite. I don't need some big, giant, warrior-looking dude. I need someone who's going to serve only me, my will, and see himself as a servant, not to man, but to me. So here we are. Samuel visits a man named Jesse and his sons, and he begins to interact with them. God leads him right where He wants him to go, and there's Jesse. And he begins to meet some of the sons. He meets the eldest son, Eliab. He's 6'5", strong as an ox. So Samuel, I think, like naturally thinks, hey, this is the guy. This Eliab guy is my guy. God says, let's see what he says. 1 Samuel 16:7-8. Do not look at his appearance or the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. Not like completely, just that's not who I want. For God sees not as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Again, you might argue, I think accurately, that God knew exactly what was going to happen with Saul. That doesn't mean he wanted it to happen, mind you. Again, there's God's perfect will, and then there's God's permissive will. And part of this, if you recall, is since Israel kept saying, no, we don't want you, God, as our king, we want a human king, God said, fine, I'll give you, again, this idea of a poster boy, this poster child for what a king should look like all the other kings around. And so, again, this is that idea that God gave them exactly what they prayed for, and then they kind of regretted it afterwards. But God is basically telling Samuel now, listen, and he's like saying, listen, the last king was chosen because of all this stuff. He had the height, he had the strength, he had the military might, the background. But this next king will only be chosen for no reason other than where his heart belongs. Okay, so again, that's God's only prerequisite for any of this. And he's saying, okay, I'm going to step away from what everyone perceives as what a king should be. So Samuel keeps scanning through the sons of Jesse, different sons, and he keeps going through. He goes through 10 of them before finding any kind of winner. And even then, he's like, is there anything else? Is there someone else here? And then Jesse admits that the only son remaining is the son he didn't think was even worth bringing up. He didn't think he would be someone who even ever would have a leadership position, let alone a king, right? So Jesse goes and he grabs David and brings him out in front of Samuel, and God says, anoint him. This is who I want. This is my guy. So God is making a statement here, and again, I think it can't be underscored enough, that he doesn't care about size, strength, or age, and he cares about the person's heart. So we're going to see that play out in real time here in a moment, and it's a story that you are very familiar with. You might say it's a gigantic story. Huh? Okay. One legendary church evangelist from history, someone named D.L. Moody, once said, the world has yet to see what God can do with a person who's fully surrendered to him. I appreciate this statement because obviously we kind of get a very good glimpse of that in David. But see all that David did, not just, taking on a giant is no small feat, and that is not any kind of dad joke or pun. I'm just saying it's no small feat. The point is that he physically did that, and he did many other great military, mighty adventures. But again, David gives us an example of what D.L. Moody is talking about. He didn't have to have the giant height or appearance. He was a warrior, not just in heart, but he was a warrior for God. And it wasn't just about fighting and military. He was about bringing peace. And because of his willingness, we eventually get a huge time of peace with his son, Solomon. So anyway, getting back, we see an example of what God is talking about and what it can look like when we find our identity. And that's really what we're talking about today. And that's what I really want to get to, is that we see in David someone who's fully secure in who God created him to be, his identity. And because he knows fully who God created him, he has security. He doesn't lose heart when people look unfavorably or even favorably at him. He's not swayed by that. He has security in who God says he is. And so God chooses whom he chooses, and he chooses those whose hearts are surrendered to him. Again, I think that's a great way to put it too, because when we think about it, David fully surrendered to what God called him to do. So if it meant taking on a giant, so be it. If it meant taking on, as a boy, if it meant taking on a bear or a lion, he did it. And he did it not because he himself felt so brave. He did it because that's what God called him to do. And it was as simple as just doing what God called him to do. And again, as I said, David's security comes from God. He believes fully that he is who God says he is. And it shows in his security that as he takes on Goliath. So I said, we're going to see all this play out in real time. David often is considered a boy at this point, which means he could only be about 12. Why? Because in the Jewish tradition, he becomes a man at 13. So everyone calls him a boy. Even when his older brothers, even Samuel, when he meets him, he says, "Who's this boy?" So he can't be any more than 12. Maybe younger. We're not sure, but he's certainly not 13 and a man. And so when he arrives, and you probably know the story, David arrives because his father sent him. His brothers tell him to go home. David gets angry at the giant, yelling out slurs against God, slurs against God's people. He gets angry and challenges him. They accept the challenge. He goes, grabs some stones from the creek, throws a rock between the eyes of Goliath. And this is the part most people forget, that he then cuts off Goliath's head, as a person would do after a fight like that. But you have to remember, David only had the sling. So where did he get the sword? Yeah, that's right. He had to grab Goliath's gigantic sword to chop off his head. So that screams to me someone who is very confident in what God was going to do with him and pretty fearless. And he didn't have to be 6'5", like Eliab, his brother, to do it. So that tells us that God can use anything, anyone, to his purpose. David gives us a picture of what security looks like when we believe that we are who God says we are. Again, I want to come back to that because it's so very important. Now, this kind of puts Saul into a complete free fall identity crisis. Because we see David's identity and security are based in God. It doesn't fluctuate. God is constant. God is the person who constructed us. He constructed David to be who he was going to be. And that comes from God. King Saul's identity comes from the people. And initially I wrote security here too. But as I think about it, as we're talking about, his identity comes from people because they have how they perceive him, how he perceives they're perceiving him, right? But that doesn't give you really security, because if security is not secure, it's false security, right? So he has no real security in his identity, which is why he's now having the identity crisis that he's facing. So, because in Saul's eyes, or the eyes of people, how they see him, was known for being the military guy. He was the all-star, right? The people loved him because of that. He had that warrior appearance. He walked into a room and said, "That's the guy. He's a warrior right there." And that's how he believed himself. But Saul still was not keen. He was unable. He was too timid to tackle Goliath. So he was just as scared as the rest of the Israelite army. So even in his own human might, even in his own human strength, he was too timid. He felt small compared to Goliath. So even in his own eyes, he was already facing some sort of identity crisis from that alone. Yet alone, we add David, who shows up, a boy, who easily goes out there, no problem, no fear, takes out the giant. And so people will begin walking around singing this chant. This would have been sometime after David slew Goliath and walked, and maybe had some other adventures. Saul invited him into his house. But shortly thereafter, people began walking around singing this chant of, and it was just, I'll show it to you in scripture, but it just drove Saul even crazier. 1 Samuel 18:7. Saul has slain his thousands. Okay, so the people are giving Saul very good credit there. That thousands of people is no small feat. But it goes on to say, and David has his tens of thousands, right? So David dwarfs anything Saul has done, right? So Saul obviously was not a fan of this song, this chant that kept going around. So Saul kind of retaliated. And this is where things really, he already had he was already going to the crazy town. But this is where it really gets serious. 1 Samuel 18:11. And Saul hurled a spear. When you're angry. For he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David evaded him twice. So it wasn't just one throw of a spear, it was two. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. So I don't know if you've ever really played a really good game of dodgeball or something. I know sometimes you're not allowed to play, but was there ever someone on the other side you really wanted to get, and you threw it and just they kept dodging it? I know it's the name of the game, but it just how it infuriated you. Imagine you're Saul, and you're attacking David with a spear. The fact that you can't hit David the fact that you want to hit him is already infuriating, and the fact that you can't is probably even more infuriating. But I think what we're seeing here is, and I don't want you to miss this, is that it says at the end that the Lord was clearly with David, and he had departed his presence, his anointing, his hand of just God's presence removed from Saul and put on David. And that was clear to Saul. Now this is interesting. So Saul would have been fully aware that God chose David. So by Saul attacking David, Saul's kind of attacking God here too. He's attacking God's plan. He's still living in this mindset that he can alter or force God's hand. He can alter or force his own will upon God. And so it's probably not surprising then that Saul can't hit David because God will simply not allow it. Now, maybe that's true, maybe that's not so true. We're not really sure. Clearly, David was really good at dodgeball. But secondly, even if Saul had been successful, would God have not already had in mind yet another person? The point is that Saul would never outdo God's plan. Saul will never alter God's plan in that way, in that fashion. He could never force his will upon God. So ultimately what we're saying here on a deeper level is that Saul is just angry, yes, at David, but also at God. So, which is, again, sad, where just like David, Saul could have found and been secure in his identity in God, but he wasn't. So again, the thing King Saul is known for, being the big military guy, the powerhouse, is the very thing that David has taken away. Not because David sought that. It was just David's nature to serve God, and in so doing, earn the respect from other people that he was now the military guy and Saul wasn't. So David's, again, identity wasn't altered by people's view of him, but that began to be what people viewed him as. So Saul is defined again by what he does, his job, so to speak. And when he loses that status in the eyes of people, he loses his identity. Again, I don't think we're any different. We face the same challenges that Saul does. When we begin to listen to what other people say about us, when we begin to expect some sort of affirmation from people and not God, that is very uneven ground, because that's like building on sand. It can crumble any moment. Saul, again, serves as that example, and this really the whole series, of what can happen to us when our identity is found in someone or something other than God. So what do we begin to see happen? Okay, number one, we get angry. Why did that person hang out with that other person last night? Or why does this person keep making these stupid posts? We begin to get very angry at the things around us, the people around us. We begin to get jealous of the fact that one of our friends may be becoming greater friends with these friends of ours that are supposed to be our, we begin to have these irrational, jealous thoughts. And then we get paranoid. We start reading into things. We start maybe going back over old texts or rereading them. And we begin stalking people's social media, thinking that every move someone is making is all about like how they're going to, upset us, or that's their intent. We begin to have these irrational thoughts like everything is a conspiracy against us. And then lastly, we then, as a result, begin to try and manipulate or control people. We can see all these actions in Saul. We see him manipulating, controlling, because throwing a spear at someone is trying to alter something, right? So the point is that when our identity, and again, we cannot say this enough, when our identity is found in things other than Jesus, those things will shift or falter or fail ultimately. People will fail because that is the nature of what people do. Only with God is anything secure. So you might be asking, Jim, how do we avoid becoming like Saul? Go ahead, ask it. Very good. I'm so glad you asked. Let's look at that for a sec. This one character in this story that we haven't really talked about yet. I've mentioned him before, but he doesn't go by David or Saul. Instead, let's introduce Saul's son, Jonathan. As I mentioned last week, Jonathan is the son of the king. In the eyes of the people, and talking about the eyes of the people again, that's who Jonathan is. He would have been next in line if Saul had been more faithful, obedient. He would have been arguably the most powerful position in the world at the time, king of Israel. So one question that we might ask is, how do you think Jonathan felt after he watched David slay Goliath and win over the hearts of the people? So let's look at that. Let's look at Jonathan's response. This goes back to 1 Samuel 18, 1-4. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. So let me break that down real quick. He saw not only like a brother of sorts. It was almost as if anything that was against David would instantly, in Jonathan's eyes, be an insult to him. Anything that attacked David would be an attack to him. So Jonathan saw God's presence on David, and we're going to dive into that a little bit more here. But that idea that he became one is that he saw in David God's presence, God's leading, and so that was for Jonathan enough to say, I need to see him succeed, right? So from that day, Saul, this was after Goliath, Saul was not hurling spears just yet. Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. And then it goes on to say, and Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. So this idea, remember, God made a covenant with Israel. It's a bond of sorts. It's a promise. It's all of those things that we'll work together to do this thing. You have your side, I have my side, and joined together they will make things better. So I bring that up because this covenant Jonathan makes is to again see God's will be done through David. Okay, so that's this idea that he's going to treat David as he treats himself. Jonathan took off his robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword and his bow and his belt. So these aren't just lying around Israel. Very few people actually had swords that we're talking about. Very expensive to make. Same with bow and belts. His tunic and his robe. These were like not just gifts. These would be kingly gifts. So what we see in Jonathan's reaction really is that he's seeing David as the kingly presence that he should have. And so he's kind of elevating David, where he's also kind of bringing himself a little lower. And that is really Jonathan's response. Because instead of responding like we talked about, anger, jealousy, paranoia, and manipulation, Jonathan gives up the very thing he could be tempted to view as his identity and self-worth. So remember, because all his life he would have been the king's son. Oh, he'll be the king someday. And in the instant that he could try and grasp onto that and try and stay with that, he gives it up. what I recognize in Jonathan, I think we do a disservice sometimes in that we miss, is that Jonathan, I think, recognized God's presence with David before even David did, or maybe in a greater way than David did, because he instantly recognized that he didn't need all this stuff to be a servant of God, because God had chosen a great servant in David. But Jonathan wanted to join in service to God and join in God's plan and vision by giving up these things so he could promote David beyond himself. And I think, so in today's lesson, we see not just one, but two people whose identity did not come from the people, did not come from worldly views. It came from how God saw them. And I think Jonathan also represents that in a great fashion. And again, Jonathan serves as the example of how we can avoid putting our identity in the wrong things, or people who are guaranteed to shift, fall, fail. And unlike his father, again, we see this two odd people, like Saul and his son, two very different views. Saul could have been, much like Jonathan, his whole kingship, his whole time as king, but he chose not to. Whereas Jonathan fully embraced God, who God created him to be. And even when challenged with that, he gave it up to God's plan ultimately. Our identity can be found in the thing we refuse to lose, which is, in this case, we must refuse to lose who God said we are and give it up for some sort of worldly vision, or what the world says or the people say we are. I think, one thing I would like to point out before we close is that, we had two people from very different walks of life. You had David, who was kind of a nobody, and yet still felt very secure in who he was when God pulled him out of nothingness, right? And then you had Jonathan, who was always in the eye of the people, was seen as the heir to the throne, and yet when given the opportunity to try and rebel against that, when it was seemingly taken away from him, he gave it up, maybe given up is not even the right word. He just recognized God's plan over his own self ambition, and yet had full security in his identity in God, because he was still a child of God, still a servant, much in the same way that David was. And so two very opposite worlds, yet two very secure men who chose to do things God's way rather than their own. And so with that, I do hope and encourage you to take away today that find your identity in God rather than man or in the world. And then in so doing, you will find security and direction as well. So with that, I hope you have a wonderful and blessed day, and we'll talk to you later. Bye.